Ave cohort. It is Friday and not Saturday, but since the day job has me tomorrow, we're going to be doing Pilum Teaches DCS today instead of tomorrow. So if you're here catching the VOD from today's performance tomorrow, then great, welcome back, welcome aboard. If you're here with me live, however, for the first time today, it should be a good time too. We have a lot of talky bits today. We're going to be diving into some of the historical information about some of these different missiles that are in play, focusing on the air-to-air missiles first. We're going to be covering some of the Western systems, we're going to be covering some of the Eastern systems, and really kind of getting a little bit into the hows and whys and some of the historical tidbits and all that about these missiles in particular. So with that, let's go ahead and get into the game, and we will visit Tonopah and our little petting zoo here. And if we are done with all the talky bits and got some time left, we will absolutely make time to go up and get some flying done. So with that though, let's go ahead and step around the hangar and we'll visit our first friend of the day. We have an F-4 Phantom and we've got some air-to-air missiles on board. We're going to be starting with the infrared missiles. And on this outboard pylon here, we have our first encounter with the AIM-9B, or the GAR-8. This is one of the earliest missiles that we have available in DCS for the Western forces that is infrared guided. It's one that we used an awful lot up to and including in the Vietnam War. The AIM-9B is got a narrow seeker head. It's only about a 15-degree forward-looking cone. You can kind of tell that just by looking at the little dome that the seeker's in. It doesn't really move around a whole lot. It's one that was designed to hunt down bombers, but it does so with infrared seeking guidance. So it's not very capable for maneuvering, which comes into play both in using the weapon, and its seeker head sensor is not overly sensitive, which makes this missile a rear aspect only missile, meaning that you have to be able to see the heat source, generally coming up from behind on the aircraft, in order for the missile to have a chance of seeing that target and giving you the good growl to let you know that it is ready to fire. You're really looking at G limits that are very low. Anything more than a couple of Gs and this missile is not going to be able to come off the rail and successfully guide to the target. Its motor is also a little bit weak. Its body shape is very small, so its range is a lot more limited. The missile smoke that it produces is very visible, very easy to see. But when you have nothing else for the options, this is really kind of the best avenue to go. This was a Navy missile originally, as there was a time before we had the same sorts of weapons on just about every aircraft in the arsenal. The Navy was really kind of responsible for its own arms development and equipment. And this missile started its life as a purely Navy weapon. The Air Force had a missile that they used called the AIM-4 Falcon, which was worse in just about all respects compared to the AIM-9, but it was an Air Force missile and it was smaller and could fit into the conformal weapons bays of things like the F-102 and F-106. So they could carry a few of those. And they looked an awful lot like a mix between a very small Maverick and an R-60 aphid missile that we'll see here in a little bit. Historically speaking, too, the AIM-9B in particular is one that was first employed on Sabre jets that were given to the Republic of China. That would eventually become Taiwan. And one of those missiles was fired into a MiG-15 and did not detonate. And that missile was brought home, back to its base. It was then given to the Soviet Union, who then reverse engineered it and developed the Atoll missile based on the AIM-9B Sidewinder designs, with all of the same limitations and everything else. The Soviets did a lot of those kinds of things during that time frame. China would eventually take over the fine art of, I'm just going to go ahead and make this mine and take it from you and do things with it. But in this particular case, the one-for-one parts commonality was so well done a machine that one could take the seeker head off of an Atoll missile and attach it to an AIM-9B's body, and it would work. It could do everything that it needed to do. So it was a very, very exacting copy. Sadly, we don't have some of the other weapons. In a very technical sort of sense, we have a variant of the AIM-9C, which is the AGM-122 sidearm anti-radiation missile. That one's not on display here. Neither is the AIM-9 Delta, which was used a lot during Vietnam, which is a slightly newer variant. But what we do have is this AIM-9J. Where the AIM-9 Sidewinder B was introduced roughly around like 1950, 51 or so, and really kind of came into its own in the mid-50s, shortly after the Korean War. The AIM-9J is one that was developed in like the 60s and 70s. It's a quite possibly the most period-accurate type missile that you could use if you're doing a Vietnam-era styled conflict or something similar. It is still a rear aspect only missile, but its seeker head has a little bit better range and scope that it can find a target with. While you can uncage it, it doesn't actually give you the same high-pitched tone that you would be expecting on later model Sidewinders. So when the tone goes away is a chance to fire, as long as you had the growl before you push the uncage button. Same sort of deal though, the propellant motor in the back is very visible. That smoke is going to be seen a long ways off. The missile itself is not as maneuverable as later variants, but is more maneuverable and more capable overall than the Sidewinder B that we have that preceded it. Phantoms can carry these. A lot of the other aircraft will carry a variant of the AIM-9J. This should not be confused with the AIM-9 Julie, which is more akin to like an AIM-9L with an AIM-9M seeker head attached to the front. It's primarily an export weapon for the AIM-9 Julie. So the J, though, that's one that we used for a very long time, up until kind of the late 70s, early 80s, when we started phasing those out and replacing those missiles with AIM-9L and later AIM-9M. We're going to ignore the Sparrows here for now. We're focusing on the infrared missiles, so we'll come back to those. And we're just going to go ahead and move across the pylon to the AIM-9L. AIM-9L is quite possibly one of the most used and most common variants that you'll see of a Sidewinder missile. It is very similar to its neighbor here, which is the AIM-9M. The motor produces more smoke than the AIM-9M, and the seeker head is slightly less sensitive, and G-limit's less capable than the AIM-9M. However, in most other respects, they perform more or less about the same. The biggest thing with this one, though, is this is the first time that we see a Sidewinder that is capable of all aspect tracking, meaning that you could shoot head-on. It's got a seeker head that is chilled to an extremely low temperature that makes it much more sensitive than its predecessors. We started using different gases and, in some cases, fluids, which are either contained in the pylon, depending upon the aircraft, or sometimes in a separate storage bottle that is kept inside the pylon and attached to the missile before firing. Which, in some cases, means that you can only keep this missile active and looking for targets for only, a bunch of minutes before it runs out of gas to keep the seeker head cooled, and then the missile becomes more or less inert on the rail. It's not going to be able to guide to anything unless it is incredibly hot out in front of it. So that's just something to keep in mind. We've talked about that in the Tomcat video, especially as Heapler does model things like that for the AIM-9Ls and Ms for the Tomcat. But if ever you got into a situation where you had your missiles ready to go and then at some point they just stopped, that's most likely what it is you've ran out of coolant for the missile and it's not able to do what it needs to do. Moving over to its cousin here, the AIM-9M. This is one of the most ubiquitous missiles. Just about all of the modern aircraft can carry it in some fashion or form. Short of the AIM-9X, the AIM-9M is one that we used a lot. We used Ls and Ms kind of together because, weapons are good, so if they're capable enough, you'll end up bringing those to the fight to do what you need to do with. So they kind of had very common service. The 9L we see in the late 70s, about 75, 76 or so. The AIM-9M we see on the field here about 1982. So these missiles have been around a long time, and from 1982 until we see the AIM-9X become available, that's really kind of the paradigm and pinnacle of missile capability here. The seeker head on the M is extremely sensitive. It has a good reach for its seeker head to find targets that are slightly off the bore sights. You don't have to be quite as locked up with the target. They can be slave to the radar just like the AIM-9L can to be able to track their target, where with earlier missile systems that was not a capability the weapon had. So all around the AIM-9M, very, very competent, very good missile. And one of the other generalities to note here is that as we have newer and newer missiles, they are capable of better and better turns, thus sustaining a higher G-load. Their seeker heads tend to be more on the sensitive side and thus able to find their targets quickly. And as we get into the even later models like AIM-9M and AIM-9X, they have alternative methods of tracking their targets that help reduce the susceptibility to flares. That's kind of the big thing, is that when an IR missile is fired, generally you're going to be dumping flares to get rid of those and also maneuvering sharply to try and get that missile to fly outside of its limits and overshoot you, especially if it is very close in. Something like an AIM-9B, you can really almost get away with just maneuvering sharply, and the missile is probably going to overfly you. Something like an AIM-9L, M, or X, though, maneuvering alone is definitely not going to be enough, so you're going to definitely want to make sure that you dispense your flares. Before we get into the fanciness of the AIM-9X, we're going to talk about the AIM-9P series, because the P series is an export variant of the Sidewinder. So if you're trying to do like historically oriented type missions along those lines, just because the P is a higher letter than J does not necessarily mean that the weapon itself is better. The AIM-9P comes in a few different variants. On this side of this Tiger, we have a AIM-9P with no additional numerical designation. This is very similar in performance and in limitations to the AIM-9J. It's a rear aspect only weapon, despite P coming long after L in the alphabet there. Its motor is extremely visible when it's been fired. Its seeker head is more sensitive than the B, but in some ways it's about as sensitive as the J. And it doesn't have the same sort of flare rejection capabilities as later models. The big thing that we had with that is that we were giving these to our allies so that they would have a missile that was mostly capable, but not as capable as some of our latest and greatest. On the opposite pylon here, we have the AIM-9P5. And the P5 is unique as it's finally an export variant that has all aspect locking capability. This AIM-9P5 is very similar to like an AIM-9L in just about all respects. It has a different motor in it, and it has a little bit less on the G limits for being able to track its target and do its work. But overall, it's a very capable missile for the export market. So if you're doing something with like a lot of NATO allies and things, that's an option that you would throw downrange. P5 is going to be on the scene at a time kind of like very late 70s to early to mid 80s. The earlier P variants are going to be like almost half a generational step ahead of their counterparts. So if you're looking at something like an AIM-9J or an AIM-9D, and you're going to be using a P instead, that'd be something fitting for something that's 5-6 years after introduction with American forces, because we, just didn't give the best in the best to everybody else out the gate. Coming on over here to the next side. Oh, actually, that is not a P5 on the aircraft. Forgive me. This one here is a P3, which is a rear aspect only missile, but otherwise is in that in-between. On the F-16 here on this outer pylon, we have the P5, which we've talked about already. But then we finally come to the ultimate king of maneuverability and lethality for our infrared missiles. For Western forces, we have the AIM-9X, which you can kind of see its little seeker head here. It's got some gimbals on it to look around. It's got all kinds of different bells and whistles to try and provide electronic countermeasures to ignore flares and focus in on its target and identify its target, not just by its thermal signature, but by the shape that it can see, its little sensor here in the front. One of the other things that you'll notice very quickly with the AIM-9X is that it doesn't have these big fins on the back. It's got very small fins, front and rear, and some of that is to fit into internal weapons bays on some of our more modern aircraft, and some of that is to make it more aerodynamically capable in the short fight. It uses a nozzle here in the back that's got a little bit of thrust vectoring. It's got little jets on the outside of the missile's shape and body and everything else to try and help it maneuver. This missile is extremely capable and thus able to do things like high off-bore attacks, 90 degrees off one side of the aircraft, and be sighted in using the helmet. Depending upon what we see here in just a couple of months, as DCS had promised in their 2025 video, and I'm sure they're not going to deliver on. But the F-35 may even be able to launch this weapon in such a way where it can attack aircraft almost in the rear of the target. There's a lot of capabilities that are useful for this weapon, but it means that it needs to be able to pull 22 or more Gs at once to try and get off the rail and go attack that target and get that target eliminated. Where other missiles might be able to pull 15 or 20 Gs in something like the AIM-9M, or upwards of 9 or more in the case of like the L or the J. It's a far cry from its origins in the late 40s when it was being developed, and mid 50s when it first entered service with the AIM-9B. So very deadly, very capable missile, and one of the most modern that we have here in DCS. And we just kind of mirror those there on the other side for that aircraft. But we're not done with infrared missiles yet. I'm going to skip over the Tomcat here for now, and we're going to come up to the other side, as it were. And we're just going to take these as they go, so it's going to be jumping from era to era here, as we've got some other MiGs in the background to stare at. So here we have the R-73. This one actually came out earlier than AIM-9X. So if you are looking for a historical engagement set in like the late 90s and early 2000s, prior to the development of 9X, the R-73 is really kind of the king of the roost there. This one was capable of attacking targets up to 60 degrees off the bore and linked to a helmet sight. Very simple sense that the Soviets were using. It's a very dangerous missile in the short-range fight, and it fills the same sort of role as the 9X. It's all aspect. It's can be very difficult to both see and defeat. So something to watch out for. Inboard of that, we have the R-27T. This is not the extended range version, so it's the shorter one. But we'll talk about this here in a minute as we roll through some of the other missiles, because you're going to see a lot of missiles that have a lot of similarities to them as we move on from this point. This one is unique that it is a very long-range infrared missile. This is a missile that can attack you from the BVR with infrared. So there's no radar warning to let you know that you've been fired upon. You really just kind of got to watch out for the missile trail and trust your instincts that potentially you may have been fired upon. The missile itself is not as maneuverable as, dogfight missiles like the R-73, but it relies on stealth to get in and destroy its target, as it's very difficult for you to figure out if you've been fired upon. Moving down to these forward pylons on this J11/Su-27, we have the R-27R on both forward pylons. And this is a radar-guided version of this missile with very similar ranges, similar performance, similar maneuvering capabilities. But the difference is that these are semi-active radar homing missiles, and since we're talking about IR, we're going to brush past that real quick and move on to the MiG-21. So on the outboard pylon, we have the R60, and on the inboard pylon, we have the R60M. These are extremely similar looking missiles to one another. Very minor differences in the visual appearance of those missiles, but they are distinctive in that the R60M is more capable in a head-on engagement than the R60. It is possible for the R60 to be carried even on helicopters, and in the same sort of paired pylon arrangement that we'll see later on with the MiG-23. The explosive charge on these is very small, so it's possible to survive a hit from one of them. But survive a hit and fight after taking a hit is two very separate encounters there on that. These have been in service for a very long time. AFID has more or less been on the scene since they stopped developing their version of the AIM-9B and the K-13 missile. So these have been around since easily mid-70s or so plus, so you can use these just about any time. In terms of historical context, they were designed originally to shoot down our own bombers, like our B-52s, but they are also, with the R-60M especially, definitely more capable against fighter-sized and fighter-shaped targets. To come around to the other side of this MiG-21, we see the R3R and R3S missiles, respectively, inboard to outboard. And as we come here and look at the R3S, this Atoll B, it looks very much like the AIM-9B Sidewinder we saw in the other one, almost an exact copy all the way down to the last rivet. If you were to take the seeker head off of this missile and replace it instead with a radar, semi-active radar homing missile head, you get the R3R, which we'll talk about here in a little bit when we get to radar-guided missiles, but you can easily see the visual distinction between the two. The Atoll B has all of the same limitations as the AIM-9B, right down the line. There's really no difference between those two. So all the same limitations that would apply to a Sidewinder B also apply to that missile. Cruising on back here to this other MiG-21, we've got a couple of weapons that are available, including another Sidewinder clone. But we're going to talk about this infrared guided missile here. This is the R-55, which, despite having a very high numerical designation, is one of the earliest Soviet infrared missiles. And this is really where we start to see some doctrine form for the Soviets in terms of how they employ their air-to-air weapons. And we'll get to that as we talk about the radar-guided missiles here in just a minute. This is extremely low capability for this missile. It is still dangerous, and if you do nothing to defeat it, it will still kill you if it's fired in good parameters. But this is overall less capable than the Sidewinder missile that followed it, after they found one of ours and went, oh crap, that looks really good. So this is really kind of useful against like bomber-sized targets with bomber-sized maneuverability. Wasn't in service all that long, but this is some of the earliest missiles that you can employ on the jet. On the outboard pylon on either side, we have the K-13 or K-13 1M Sidewinder type missiles or Sidewindskis. These are about as capable as AIM-9Ls. Both of them are all aspect seeking, so they can be fired in a head-on engagement. They have better flare rejection than the others, better maneuvering limits than the others. So overall a very dangerous missile, and for infrared missiles on board this aircraft is probably one of the most dangerous that it can carry. Difference though is volume. If you fully kitted out this aircraft with nothing but the best and brightest of its Sidewindskis that you can put on board, you've got 4 missiles available. If you were to do the same with these R-60s, as we zip back over to the other aircraft, these actually come in pylons that are capable of carrying 2 missiles each, so it can carry 8. But the missiles are smaller, and if you maneuver super hard before you fire the outboard pylons, you might lose the outboard pylons in high-G maneuvers. So something else to keep in mind there with that. We'll play a guessing game here at the end about what aircraft was probably going to be in that bay until I replaced it. But we're going to move over here to the MiG-23 and the R-24T Apex missile. This one is also an infrared guided missile. It's also a BVR infrared guided missile, which makes it very dangerous. But as we'll note, before we come back to talk about it, it's got the same general body as the R-24R, and there's reasons for that we'll come back to. It's not as maneuverable, kind of suffers the same sort of problems as the R-27, where compared to infrared dogfighting missiles, it is not as nimble. However, you get range and stealth. This is a missile, of course, that will not provoke an RWR response from any aircraft. While it might alert a missile launch warning system if those aircraft is so equipped, the only thing that you've got as an indicator that this weapon is being sent at you is the smoke trail if you saw it. And in a BVR engagement, that might be very tiny. It is possible to see those smoke trails from a very far distance away, but you run into problems of, if you weren't looking in the spot where it happened, then you might very well have been fired upon without realizing it, and the smoke may dissipate before you have a chance to figure out that it's been sent your way. While we're here, we'll talk about the JF-17 and the PL-5E2s that are on its wings. And despite the fact that they look like extremely capable Sidewinders, in many ways they are a little bit less capable. The one singular advantage that they seem to have over AIM-9Ps, they are technically all aspect, so they're similar to like a P5, and they seem to have a greater maximum range out to about 7 nautical miles in the most ideal of conditions to be able to hit and kill your target. However, the seeker head is small, the onboard coolant for the missile is very short. You really don't get a whole lot of time to be able to use those missiles and have them work. They are not suitable to a lot of different things to find the target. Once you've locked onto a target and it's got a good high tone, it can expand a little bit, but they're not as uncageable as like AIM-9Ms would be. Overall, the missile is capable in its own right, but less capable than other missiles of its similar type. I would almost rather use a P5 or a Julie instead of the PL-5E2s, but you go with what you got. Then we come over here to the R-530, which is the French's interpretation of a beyond visual range infrared guided missile. We're starting with the larger missile here on this pylon. This one's got a reach 10 to 12 nautical miles on a good day. Not nimble at all, which is a problem of the missile being large. Despite the fact you got all these big fins on it and this very large, imposing looking conical motor on the back. Once that motor's burned out, it's subject to aerodynamic forces and air resistance and everything else. And the bigger the missile is, the more those things affect it. So you're really looking at a missile that is going to be fired from a stealth type perspective. But rear on would be better than head on. I don't believe this one is capable of head on attacks, or would be less capable in a head on attack. And technically speaking, any of these missiles that are listed as rear aspect only, if the target is hot enough forward on, and you've got enough of an angle where you can catch like their afterburner in motion, it's a possibility you might be able to lock onto a target and shoot in a head-on type engagement. But they are less capable of doing that. On this aircraft, we've actually got a Matra Magic 1, which is the French take on a short-range missile. And one of the reasons why you see that as compared to other European forces which use Sidewinders or Sparrows or other similar type weapons is that there was a period of time where France had militarily left NATO's sphere of influence to do their own thing. It's kind of a big to-do with that. They saw themselves as the defender of continental Europe. and wanted to have a degree of independence on that. So they developed some of their own kit and equipment prior to, the big sort of European fold that we see these days, where there's a lot of sharing between different European nations, as we'll see with like the Eurofighter Typhoon. But even then, the French like using their Rafales and a lot of their own gear and equipment. So this is what we got, Matra Magic 1. This one is a rear aspect, primarily missile. In some ways, it's a little bit more agile than Sidewinder. In other ways, it is less capable in Sidewinder. So I would put this one probably equivalent to what we talked about with like an AIM-9J or an AIM-9P or P3. The missile is very quick off the rail. It's got a decent range to it. It's somewhat difficult to defeat if you're not expecting it, but not overly so. Flares maneuvering, of course, is going to defeat just about every weapon here. And if you can, fly with the sun behind you. The sun is the world's most extreme flare, so keep that in mind as well. On the opposite pylon, we've got a radar missile that we'll talk about here in a little bit, but we've got an AIM-9 Julie, which you can see a lot of the similarities between the Seeker head up front with something like the later model Sidewinders, and a body and fin assembly there that's common with some of the earlier variant Sidewinders. It's an export missile designed to give them better capabilities, so it kind of sits in that in-between period of AIM-9L and AIM-9M. But that's going to be a later and more modern missile in your historical engagements if you're looking to put them together. Especially if you're looking to do something like 6-Day War, especially with the Mirage. Mirage is a good aircraft for something like that. Where you're using a lot of Matra 1s and these R530s. Closing in on the next hangar, we have the Matra Magic 2, which is similar to like an AIM-9M Plus. This one is extremely capable, and in this particular variant, we do have the missile warning system, which uses a combination of the missile's infrared seeker head to look forward and warn of missile launches, and these extra little detectors on the back to watch in the rear arc. Magic 2 is a vast improvement over Magic 1. They both look very similar to one another, but the external similarities is really all they've got. Outside of that, you're really looking at the deep down electronics and seeker head technology and those sorts of things that separate it from its earlier series. So we come on over here to the MiG-31, and since we're still talking about infrared missiles, we're going to talk about the Acrid here on this pylon. Model for it is a little on the scuffy side because it's one of the older variants there as far as Eagle Dynamics is concerned. However, this one is an even longer range variant of a lot of the infrared missiles that we've seen so far. It's a big missile, so obviously not going to be very maneuverable, at least compared to other missiles of its type. But what it's got is reach, and if you can send this missile 40 miles away in the infrared at a very hot target that is not aware of the fact that you fired at it, your chances of killing it are pretty good because it's not going to know to drop flares and turn. That really kind of rounds out our infrared missiles. Now we're going to zip back here to the F4. And we're going to talk about some of the radar-guided missiles, as we've got several examples on these aircraft here. Starting up front with the the AIM-7E Sparrow. The AIM-7E Sparrow and the air missile behind it, the AIM-7E2, are some of the earliest examples of Sparrow that we have in DCS. Again, these started as Navy projects before they became Air Force projects, mostly because of the tri-service agreements and the realization for the military that we can't just keep developing things on our own. The AIM-4 Falcon was very instrumental in helping make that decision because the Sidewinder was such a vast improvement, even in its B model, over the AIM-4 Falcon that we basically sat down and went, look guys, you can't have your own development here. You're going to be using some Navy equipment like Navy Phantoms, so you're going to be using some Navy missiles as well to make sure that you can get the job done. Sparrow really kind of gave us our first shot at beyond visual range engagements. It is a semi-active radar homing missile, or a Fox-1, depending upon how easy you want to look at that, which basically means that this is a missile that relies upon the radar system of the jet to continuously track the target singularly all the way to impact. Like most of the missiles that are in here, this one carries a continuous rod warhead in it. Some of the earlier model Sidewinders use blast fragmentation instead, but expanding rods are kind of the way to go for that, because the missile will detonate. It will throw this rod out into the space around the missile where it went up, and presumably tear through, components of the aircraft, and then let aerodynamic forces do the rest of the work. The AIM-7Es, specific to the Phantom, require 4 seconds of continuous lock time before they are synced enough with the radar and the guidance system of the missile to be able to track it. Once radar energy has stopped illuminating the target, the missile stops guiding, as there's no onboard radar of its own to help steer the weapon. Broadly speaking, when it comes to Sparrow, as you progress through the alphabet, the more capable the missile becomes, both in seeker head technology, in ability to engage targets in a dogfight, range and motors and propellants, explosive warhead size, those kinds of things. And we'll talk about that in detail moving through here. But focusing on the AIM-7E1, this missile here was designed for beyond visual range bomber smiting work. It's one that we did employ in the Vietnam War against fighter-sized targets, but they were very unreliable. A lot of times you'd hear, especially if you listen to like Steve Ritchie talk through different documentaries, they would fire these off in pairs. He'd ripple fire at the Sparrows. And that was just to ensure that at least one of the weapons was going to guide to its target, or rather do something other than just fall off the jet and, plummet into the ground. As missiles become more reliable, ripple firing those missiles becomes problematic. But in this particular set of circumstances, that's what we got. The E1 Sparrow was not as maneuverable as its E2 dogfight Sparrow counterpart, which is the primary difference between those two, is that the E2 was more meant for, zipping around in a dogfight, where the E1 was, I was designed to shoot down large bombers. But that's really the kind of the major highlights for that. The E2 gives us a more capable Sparrow. These are earlier variant missiles. Like these are active primarily in the 60s to the very early 70s. Prior to us in the advent have the AIM-7F. The Foxtrot Sparrow that we've got is a much more capable version than either of the Echo variants. This one has a better motor on it, so it's got more range. It's a little faster, a little less maneuverable than the E2, but the seeker head on it is also better tuned, better sensitive, and only requires 2 seconds worth of lead time, in the Phantom in particular, before being able to guide to its target. So AIM-7F, very good missile all around. For the Foxtrot variant, you're looking at basically any time between the mid-70s, like 1973, 74, up through about 1980, 81, 82, before the advent of AIM-7M. The M and MH, which we'll talk about here as we move through, because we got the AIM-7M here on the back. M was the first variant of the Sparrow that is really, in a big way, kind of the peak of Sparrow technology. This has a seeker head on it that is very finely tuned. It can be fired in the Phantom as soon as you have a lock onto the target. It uses solid state electronics throughout. Now, this is a very good missile that kind of put the Sparrow all the way up to its ultimate peak. You're looking at a missile that is capable of killing a target at about 20 nautical miles well outside of the visual range perspective. This is a missile that we used all the way up and through Desert Storm. It was responsible for a majority of the kills that we've got there. Sidewinder, I think, still has more of them, but by the time we get to the M variant Sparrow, we are looking at a much better PK in this missile compared to any of its previous variants, which is a very good thing overall. They're all semi-active radar homing, but the M introduces an ability to home on jam. So if the aircraft that you're targeting has a jammer on board the aircraft and they have turned that jammer on, it is possible to use the jamming emitter of the aircraft as the guidance source, which means you no longer have to steer it with your own radar. There's particular modes for making that sort of system work for each individual jet, so you're just going to have to kind of, figure out how to engage home on jam mode, or HOJ, in your particular fighting platform of choice. Cruise past the F5 Tiger, and since we're still talking Sparrows, I'm going to cruise past the F-16 for now. We're going to come up to the Tomcat, which we have Snort's Tomcat here, Dale Snodgrass, who's responsible for being part of the program that would develop the Lantern targeting pod for Tomcat, because we do have the last two variants of the Sparrow missile here. We have the AIM-7MH and the AIM-7P. Functionally speaking, the AIM-7MH and the AIM-7P use the same sort of guidance technology. These also use a like a lofting type capability in order to get a little bit more range out of the target. Slightly better solid state electronics. This was kind of the direction we were going prior to us developing AMRAAM, and these missiles really kind of was the ultimate limit. The AIM-7P Sparrow in particular is a Navy variant of the Sparrow. This is one that they used more or less exclusively. It's not one that you see carried on Air Force aircraft. And the big difference between it and the AIM-7M or MH is the explosive warhead is bigger on the AIM-7P. It is in all other respects more or less the same missile. So similar capabilities, similar limitations. Very good all around. While we're on the Tomcat, though, we're going to come on down here and look at the AIM-54 Phoenix, which is a very long-range missile. It was, for a very long period of time, our longest-range air-to-air missile, capable on the most optimistic of days of successfully engaging a backfire bomber at 180 miles or more. Ideally, however, you're looking at targets that are probably going to be not much further than 50 nautical miles away, all the way down to about 35 nautical miles away for a fighter-sized target. And there's some limitations that are built into this missile just out the gate. Phoenix was originally designed and conceived as the F-111B's primary missile armament. It's also one that we've got there's another aircraft that we were going to be using very briefly that was going to be part of this too, that had 6 of these missiles carried on its wings. The name Gunslinger seems to stick in the mind, but I don't think that's quite right for that. But it was a little bit of a wild time. This is an earlier developed missile, so this is looking at like mid-60s for its final employment and evolution. The F-111B did not really come into fruition. We built a couple of those aircraft, but ultimately that fighter program disappeared and led to the program that instead developed Tomcat for 1975. The Tomcat was capable of launching up to 6 Phoenix missiles at a time and successfully guiding all of them through track while scan with the powerful AUG-9 radar to go out and reach out and kill their target. The white missiles that we have here on both fore and aft ends of this jet are the AIM-54A Phoenix with the Block 47 motors in the back and the Block 60 motors in the front. Phoenix A is one that could be spoofed somewhat easily. It relied upon a manual link between the pilot, or the RIO rather, the weapons system officer on board the Tomcat, radar intercept officer is what the Navy used for the terminology at the time. But this used a active guidance principle to find its target. So it would be guided by the aircraft's onboard radar, and then at a preset point, when it is close enough to the target, the RIO would give the command to the missile to go ahead and turn on its seeker head, either automatically through TWIS Auto or manually through a button press. And then at that point, the missile turns on the radar that's located in the nose, locates what it believes to be its target, and completes the engagement on its own without further input from the launching platform. So this is the first iteration that we see of a Fox 3 missile, which uses active radar homing in the terminal guidance phase. The primary differences between the AIM-54A and the AIM-54C, apart from the years of introduction, for the 54C you're looking at about 1983. The later model Phoenix missile uses more solid-state electronics. It does not require as much liquid missile cooling, which is contained in these little pallets that you see on the forward section of the aircraft. Without those pallets, you can't fire Phoenixes. It's just the way that that particular system works. But the 54C also had some enhanced electronic countermeasures in order to be able to try and continuously track its target, which makes it a lot more capable, a lot more deadly. There's also some automatic features on this missile compared to the 54A. And most of that means, in the case of a target track drop, like you are the Tomcat's RIO. You are engaging a target. You've fired your missile. It's traveled 20 or 30 seconds, and then that target has turned in such a way to be beaming your aircraft, and you drop the track because the radar can no longer see him. At that point, the Phoenix C will automatically turn on its seeker head and go, I'm going to try and find it, and then try and engage the first thing that it can find with its onboard radar. There's no guarantees that that's going to be the target you were intending, but it is better than the 54A situation of, well, the RIO didn't tell me to go ahead and kill the target, so I'm not going to. I'm not going to turn on my own radar. I'm just going to function like a very fat Fox 1. Phoenix is very quick off the rail. That's how it achieves its range. It also achieves its range by flying into the much, much thinner atmosphere of the planet. And what that also means is that if you start shooting Phoenixes below about 25,000 feet, you really start to see its range turn into nothing. And when we move on and talk about our next missile, you're going to see a lot of the reasons why on that, and why we transitioned to that missile instead. This missile was mainly designed to kill Soviet bombers. We had a genuine thought before the advent and widespread use of ICBMs that in the event that World War III was kicking off, Russia would be sending all of its bombers in massive waves with all kinds of weapons on board, and we needed fleet defense fighters and interceptors to go kill them. Back when what we were looking at was the Bear as the primary adversary, propeller-driven or turboprop-driven aircraft, Bear or Bison. Sparrow would be enough. You could push the F-4 Phantom, especially the Navy variant, which started life as a fleet defense fighter and interceptor. Race out there, get within 20 nautical miles, throw a Sparrow at it, and kill it. Long before it's a problem. As we developed into more capable platforms and systems and faster bombers like Backfire, now I needed something that could actually go out there and reach out and kill it quicker. So in the case of the Doomsday loadout of bringing 6 Phoenixes up, 1 in each glove station and 4 in the underwing pylons here, we would be going out with this aircraft to track and identify 6 targets and throw 6 Phoenixes out there from as far away as possible. And then if we needed to still push in closer and attack it with Sidewinders and the gun to try and knock them down. Operationally speaking, just for the historical notes there for it, the most common Cold War loadout that you'll see for the F-14 is 3 Sparrows, 1 carried in the aft recesses here in the place of these 2 Phoenixes, a pair of Phoenixes forward, and then Sparrows and Sidewinders on the glove stations. A lot of this is because of the weight limits for returning to the carrier deck. As if you're not going to go up and absolutely be certain of the fact that you were firing your Phoenix missiles, you're going to have to come back to the boat, and you're going to bring all the weapons you didn't use with you to go put it back in the ship's armory, and allow those to be used for other missions. Well, the Phoenix missile weighs 1,000 pounds each, and if you were to carry 4 or 6 Phoenix missiles on a cap deployment, you're no longer going to be able to come back to the boat and dump enough gas to be light enough to land with all that gear and equipment still on board the jet and be safe. Your bring back was a lot less. So generally speaking, we only carried a couple of Phoenixes there. In American service, we have never fired those missiles in anger at another aircraft outside of testing. However, the Iranians claim to have gotten, some kills there with their missile, and they even have a homegrown version of their own Phoenix now. Just historical notes there on those. The primary difference there's no visual difference, but the primary difference between a Block 47 motor and a Block 60 motor is that the 60 motor is going to give you faster impulse off the rail, which means that the missile is going to be much faster sooner, but it doesn't burn for as long. The C-47 is a slower burn off the rail, but it burns for a much longer period of time. So both motors have effectively the same sort of range, but the C-60 or the A-60 has a much more distinctive visual appearance and a very, very large smoke plume as it arcs up into 100,000 feet or more and then starts coming down on top of the target compared to the Block 47. So in a PvP type scenario, I would be more keen to use the 47 instead, as it's easier to mask the fact that I've shot at somebody on that. But in a primarily PvE only type setting, you can probably get away with the Block 60s and be totally fine. Continuing on with our radar extravaganza, we move on to our eastern counterparts in the form of the other semi-active radar homing missiles, the R-27R and the ER-27ER. The only difference between the R and the ER is that the ER has much greater range, hence the extended range nomenclature on the end of that. These are semi-active radar homing missiles. All 3 of them pictured here all have roughly the same sort of capabilities. Each one of those is good out to about 25 miles or less. The closer you get to the target, the more likely you are to hit it. The 27R and ER are both faster off the rail than their American counterparts, but have in some ways a little bit worse guidance. So if you were to shoot a Sparrow at the same time that somebody has shot an ER at you, or a 27 missile at you, you're likely to lose the missile race on that one. We'll talk about the R-77 here in just a moment. We're going to continue along our other semi-active guided weapons here. So we have the R3R, which, as we talked about, is basically the R3S with a radar-guided seeker head. Again, semi-active radar homing. Very similar range to a R3S or a Sidewinder B, so you're looking at dogfight ranges with this. Difference with this one, though, is that it requires the continuous radar track in order to hit you, so you're going to get an RWR warning from it. The other thing of note, too, is that if you want to get into a real technical sense, this is an AIM-9C Sidewinder. And really kind of the only example that we've seen here. The AIM-9C was developed for the F-8 Crusader as a radar-guided version of the Sidewinder. When that didn't pan out so much and the gunfighters were retired, or the Crusaders rather were retired, gunfighters is a squadron there, and they kept themselves the name of the last gunfighter, as guns was one of the primary air-to-air armaments for that jet. But when they retired the missile system there, they ended up redesigning the seeker heads and developed the standard ARM, which is a Sidewinder seeker head body with a modified AIM-9C seeker head on it, designed to hunt radars and use those for guidance. This particular missile, which is very similar to the R-55, I want to say this is an R5. I'd have to go back and actually look at that to tell you the specific designation on it. But this is a little different than semi-active radar homing, because the semi-active missiles will basically go, okay, I see what it is you're trying to illuminate and kill for me, and I'm going to calculate my best intercept to get there. This missile is not guided that way. This is actually a beam riding missile, so it just follows a straight line right down the radar beam direct towards its target. So it's basically going to be most useful in a tail-on engagement and at close range. It is in all other respects very similar to the R-55. Could it kill you in a fight? Yes, but even a little bit of maneuvering is probably going to be enough to get rid of it if the fighter behind you can't turn at exactly the sort of same rate that you are. We talked about the R-24T. We're going to talk about the R-24R. Very similar properties, very similar types of ranges and reaches. So this is basically short-range Sparrow type engagement ranges. You're looking at 10 to 15 nautical miles. But this is the radar homing version of it, which uses the same semi-active radar homing technology. In all other respects, it's about the same sort of peer type missile as its infrared counterpart. This one will alert you on the RWR that you've been fired at. Some of the best tactics to get away from a missile like this one is either beam yourself in such a way that the radar drops you for the launching aircraft, because as soon as the radar is dropped its lock, it's no longer guiding to you. Or turn away and just, pick up your throttles here for a minute or two and then turn back into the fight. The odds are pretty good that this missile is going to run out of steam before it gets to you, and once the motor's burned out, it loses airspeed pretty quickly. It is very dangerous to peer-type aircraft, so if you're shooting at like an F-4 Phantom in particular, you're all going to be as close to one another as the most capable ranges of your missiles, so pay attention to that. Come back to the JF-17. The radar-guided version of the R530 is more or less the same as the infrared-guided version of the R530, except, of course, this one can be fired at any aspect. Between the two missiles, I would say the 530 is the more capable version with the radar guidance on it than the infrared guidance, as this always seemed to be spotty at best. But it is a missile that can be fired at, 15 or so nautical miles and be reasonably expected to hit the target so long as you maintain radar lock the whole way to the target. There is a missile that is very similar to the next one that we're going to look at on our other French counterpart, because this is the probably the best example of a Fox 1 missile that we've got. And this is the Super 530 Delta. There's a variant of this missile that looks very similar that the Mirage F1 can carry, that doesn't have the boost motor on the back, as this actually has two engines on it, a boost and a sustain. So it can maintain its speed for a much longer period of time. Also shares some visual similarities with the standard ARM. With the Mirage 2000, you can expect somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 or so nautical miles for a good kill on this missile. It is extremely fast off the rail, and it maintains much more of its speed towards the end of its missile path and trajectory than Sparrow missiles or other missiles of similar types. And it is a big missile, which means a lot of explosive punch in it, so when it does get close to you and blows up, it's very likely to put the target down in one shot. It has a lot of electronic countermeasures to it, so your best bet is to deploy chaff and maneuver sharply against this one, try and get away from it, make it fly outside of its envelope. It's kind of a staple for just about every missile, but these missiles in particular are very dangerous on the Mirage. Coming back over to the Acrid, we have the radar-guided version of the missile, which is, again, similar in all respects except guidance to its infrared counterpart. It's got some decent range. It's definitely BVR, 20 miles or more. There's a possibility of being hit by that one, and while it is more agile than larger missiles, it is less agile than smaller ones, and uses the same semi-active radar homing. These missiles on the Foxbat and Foxhound and Flogger are all somewhat less capable in the electronics department than their Western counterparts, because the Soviets solve problems in different ways, usually with simpler guidance package and just larger missiles and more speed in order to get out to its target and do what it needs to do. But these are nevertheless still dangerous when they've been fired at you, and if you do nothing to defend yourself from it, you can expect to get killed. We're also going to talk about Amos, which the variant that we have here in DCS is the semi-active radar homing variant, which is why we're discussing this one now. Very similar in overall profile, though, to the Phoenix. It was designed to kill long-range bombers and big fighters from very long distances away. The R-33 is an extremely dangerous missile in that profile. It's one of the longest range air-to-air missiles in DCS, similar to Phoenix. The MiG-31 can actively track and engage a couple of targets at a time with the R-33 that we have in the game, but they do not have their own onboard radar to complete terminal guidance, so they do have to keep you locked up the whole distance to flight, which means you get a very long RWR warning that they have shot at you. They can carry up to 4, and they also get all of the extra range from these very low polygon count engines that are in the back that can push this thing up to about Mach 3 at higher altitude. Dangerous system. Dangerous long-range system. You get shot at it, maneuver away, put something between you and the launching aircraft's radar. Otherwise, you can expect this very heavy missile to come by and kill you. Otherwise, though, it does have limitations, similarly enough to Phoenix, in that at lower altitudes, it meets with a lot more air resistance and loses and hemorrhages a lot more of its range, especially once the motor's been burned out. So those are things to keep in mind for defending against such a weapon. Now, the big thing that we've got here with a lot of these weapon systems that we've looked at very recently with the Soviets is just about all of them have been in service for 30 years or more, including some of the newer variant ones that we've seen. So if you're doing something in a historical context and a historical platform, while it's funny to think that, oh yeah, lol AMRAM, it's going to solve all of our problems, or lol 9X, it's going to solve all of our problems, those systems were designed because these systems were in play. So if you are doing a mission set that is set at the end of the Cold War, for example, like 1989, 1990, prior to the advent of AMRAM-A, which is post-Desert Storm. Desert Storm ended, very early in 1991. We don't see AMRAM-A enter actual production and use aboard aircraft in a combat sense until later that same year. So, and we don't even have AMRAM-A in the game. We didn't use AMRAM-A for very long. AMRAM-B was really kind of the one that we used a lot. So if you're looking at a mission scenario that is set for about 1992, you can throw that one in and have things work and make sense. But those weapon systems were developed on account of all of these other weapon systems that were already in play and had been for some time. So there was a period of time where some of the Soviet missiles and equipment were better capable in theory than some of ours. And then there's a lot of counter development going on between the two factions and sides to round things out. So now that we've talked about a lot of those, we're going to talk about the other Fox 3s that we've got in play. And zip on over to the F-16 we've got on display, as we have two versions of AMRAM up. We have the AMRAM-B. Should, those higher, yep, there it goes. We have the AMRAM-B here on the right wing, and we have the AMRAM-C here on the left wing. AMRAM is an advanced medium-range air-to-air missile, which uses its own onboard radar to provide terminal guidance. Reliably, you can expect kills to 30 to 35 miles. This weapon system. The main differences that we see between the AMRAM-B and AMRAM-C is that the C has a little bit more range, some better onboard electronics and countermeasures and that kind of deal, so it can still successfully track its target. And physically speaking, you'll see something similar with the AIM-9X. The fins are clipped on the C variant. This was designed to fit into the internal weapons bays of like the F-22 Raptor. And, make that a little more workable. Otherwise, both of the missiles are roughly about the same sort of performance and roughly about the same sort of expectations. The B variant, you can expect to have been in service like 1992, 94. So again, if you're doing historical missions set in the mid-90s like that, that's going to be on the scene, paired with AIM-9M missiles, because 9X wasn't developed until much later. Going against those R-73s and other more advanced Soviet missile systems. The C variant that we are using is a later model C variant too, so it's got even better tracking abilities and things like that. Extremely dangerous missile. This one turns on its radar at about the 10-mile mark away from the target. It will look for the loudest radar return that it can find, which in theory should be the target you shot at. But if there's several aircraft together, like a furball going on, there's a lot of aircraft dogfighting one another. All of the active radar-guided missiles that we've seen so far have the same problem, in that this missile turns on its radar and then decides for itself which target it's going to engage and stops receiving information from the launch platform. So if you fired a missile that has gone into a furball, it turns on its radar, it starts looking around. If that furball is a bunch of MiG-21s and an F-14, all in the same bubble of space, there is a chance that the missile is going to look on its loudest radar return and engage it instead, which could very easily be the F-14. Just like you don't want to fire an infrared missile into a furball, because once the missile leaves the rail, it makes a decision about where it's going to go, separate from what the pilot tells it wants to go to. Could be into flares, it could be into a friend, it could be into your target, it could be into a different target. Once the missile has gone pitbull, that is, turned on its radar, it is on its own. Now, one of the things that you'll notice as well with the AMRAAM is that we went from the giant fat missile for the Phoenix to the slender body. AMRAAM is light enough to be carried sometimes in double rack pylons, depending upon the aircraft and its own capabilities. Like the Hornet can carry them in pairs. Much lighter, much smaller, much more aerodynamic. So this is a missile that can be fired from very low altitudes and expect very similar performance to being fired from high altitudes, which is good, because the Phoenix is one that if you fired it from extremely low altitudes, like 5,000 feet, the moment the motor burns out, that thing is basically going to drop from supersonic at like 1,500 knots to hemorrhaging half that airspeed over the next handful of seconds, and then not being useful at all outside of like 5 or 6 nautical miles in a tail chase. AMRAAM, being a lighter, smaller missile, is going to maintain more of that energy and not be as susceptible to the thick air at low altitudes, and might be able to complete that engagement where the Phoenix definitely wouldn't. From there, we have to go back to the J-11/Su-27, and we're going to talk about the R-77, or AMRAAMSky, depending upon what you want to look at with it. This is a missile that's carried by a lot of the mainstay current fighting force Soviet aircraft. Not the Su-27 in particular for the variant that they have. The J-11 here carries it because the Chinese developed that for this particular fighter. So most of the flankers you're going to fight are all going to be armed with like 27 ERs and things like that. But the 77 is an active radar-guided missile. It's maneuverable. It has a somewhat shorter range than the R-27ER, and its seeker head is somewhat less sensitive, and the missile somewhat less capable in the turns and everything else compared to like an AMRAAM-B. But it's still an active radar-guided missile, and it will still kill you if it can. This one came out after the AMRAAM-B came on the scene as a direct response to that. So it's just something to keep in mind for your historical missions. Is, if you're looking for something that is set in a very narrow window, there's a period of time where the Soviets have an advantage, there's a period of time where the Americans have, and Western forces have an advantage, and then there's a period of time where they have come back to parity a little bit with something like the 27, or the 77 rather. late model Fulcrums, like the MiG-29S, can carry 4 or 6 of these if they carry nothing else. Makes it extremely dangerous in a very agile platform that can just spit these out at you, and you're not going to know that it's fired until the missile has gone active and it hits you with its own continuous wave radar close into the target. That's the big advantage that those missiles have, is that the only pulse you're going to get on your RWR, if somebody's shooting them correctly, is going to be the cert scan, and then it will go active in the final moments before impact. So once it goes active, you need to act right now or you're dead. And sometimes you can do everything right and still get killed. So something to keep in mind there with that. The last set of Fox 3 missiles that we're going to be looking at today is the SD-10, which is a Chinese-derived copy for export of the, I believe it's the P-10 or P-12 missile. These are extremely capable. I would call these roughly on par with the AMRAAM-C. They can be carried in single or twin racks on the JF-17. It's an exclusive missile for their platform. The body of the SD-10 is used in the LD-10 anti-radiation missile, which we'll be kind of talking about some of those similarities here next. But you can see all of the same sort of highlights as the AMRAAM. It's got fins that are shaped and placed on the mid-frame and aft end of the missile. It's very small. It's light. Roughly the same sorts of ranges too. Like you're looking at 30 to 35 nautical miles as a good kill potential with this one. It is an agile weapon, so it can engage targets, very close in. It can engage maneuvering targets on the end of it, the end of its missile flight. Overall, it is a good weapon system to employ. That's kind of about it for all of our different air-to-air missiles that we've got. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some Soviet doctrine and how they employed their missiles and why some of their missiles are the way they are, and talk a little bit about what got derived from some of these air-to-air missiles, because we talked about the AGM-122 standard ARM on board the Harrier 2, can carry that one primarily. But the AIM-7Es were reused as well for the AGM-45 Shrike, which is why they've got very similar ranges for that too. Basically, what we found in the Vietnam War was that radar was going to be a much bigger deal than what we had originally thought. And we kind of thought it was going to be the end of the gunfight there too, which is why for a long time we stopped equipping aircraft with guns on them anywhere. But when it came to the SAM game, we needed a weapon system that could attack a SAM site somewhat reliably, and we didn't have one. So somebody had the bright idea of, what if we took a Sparrow Seeker head on its missile and changed how it worked? Changed what it was looking for. So what we came up with was a missile system that would look for the SA-2's fan song tracking radar on its frequency, its radar band type, and its radar strength, and basically home in on that. If you'll notice a Shrike, when it's in flight, it tends to spin. And the reason for that is pretty clever too. On the inside of the radar, I don't know if we can actually get close enough to see the radar cone itself without, no, it's not going to be there at all. But there's a nutating horn on the inside of the radar and a couple of other systems that basically spin around in a predictable little circle or star type pattern. And the Sparrow uses that particular pattern to guide to the target. Like it's looking for that, in addition to the radar energy being reflected from the aircraft. So what the Shrike is trying to do is emulate that same sort of spinning effect on the radar, producing the continuous wave system to guide to its target. It's trying to twirl and do the same sort of deal so that it can guide itself to the radar emitting on the ground. Obviously, one of the biggest disadvantages on that system is that if the radar stops transmitting, just like a semi-active radar homing missile, the Shrike will stop guiding. Some of the other problems with it is that Shrike tends to be I see the system, I'm flying straight at it, fair. It doesn't really have a whole lot of lofting capabilities. It doesn't really have a whole lot of ways of remembering where the target was located, which is why we developed other missiles. But this was a first sort of stopgap that we had for trying to find it. The other thing that we did too is that we realized that each radar system for a SAM site on the ground had its own frequency, had its own band. So we had Shrikes with multitudes of seeker head options associated with it. But unfortunately, it also meant that if you had the wrong seeker head on board, you couldn't necessarily engage your missiles, on the target with any kind of chance of success. It just won't guide. So that was kind of a development for air-to-ground missiles based on an air-to-air missile system and body. You see the same thing over here with the JF-17 with the LD-10. Harm was a different development sort of set that basically used the Shrike and went, what if we made the Shrike better? Including onboard computers and systems derived from the AGM-71 standard ARM, which I'm going to use this particular missile as its stand-in because it looks very close. The standard ARM was a very big missile, it was a very expensive missile, but it did have much greater range, much greater seeker head options to locate and identify targets, and it had a primitive onboard computer that could remember where the target was if it stopped emitting, and therefore might still complete the engagement. So for our next trick here with the Soviets, we're going to look at the MiG-23 in particular. Because again, the R-24T, shown here on our right, and the R-24R, shown here on our left, are the same overall missile body, with the only primary difference between the two of them being the seeker heads up front. It was a Soviet doctrine to use both missiles simultaneously on the target. You would fire the IR weapon first, and follow that with the radar-guided weapon, usually in quick succession with one another. The thought process behind this would be the opposing pilot would see a radar threat on their radar warning receivers, because they had that kind of technology even way back then to know that they were lit up by a radar, and would be alerted to that and drop chaff and try and maneuver very briefly to get away from the missile. But what they wouldn't do is drop flares. So if you dodged somehow the radar-guided missile, the infrared-guided missile stood a chance of hitting you too. And you can see that on multiple evolutions of this one. So with the MiG-23 Flogger, we see these missiles that have roughly the same range in the longer range category, infrared, radar seeker head. Come over here to the Chinese-derived J-11, and we've got not just the 27T and 27R, but there's an ET and an ER version that are also exactly the same missile body with different seeker heads on it. We come over here to the MiG-21, and we've got the R3S and the R3R. Same missiles, same general range and flight performance characteristics, different modes of guidance. We can even come over here to the mighty MiG-31 and see the same infrared, radar-guided seeker heads on those different weapons. This is something that they've been using in common practice for a very long period of time, and I would suspect that it would continue for the foreseeable future. I've not really seen anything that is comparable to like the R-73 in a radar-guided format, nor have I seen an infrared version of something like an R-77. So maybe they're breaking the habit on that one, maybe not. But it is something to think about when it comes to those different systems. Before we get up and go flying, though, that does leave the final last little question here that we asked very early on. And that is, this bay was empty. There was an aircraft that was going to be here. No, it wasn't the MiG-31. MiG-31 is too big to fit in this hangar, so it was always going to be out here kind of on its own. But the answer is the MiG-25. MiG-25 was going to be sitting there, but since it used the same R-40 T and ER missiles as his much bigger, later derived cousin. I went ahead and pulled this aircraft out for our display purposes here, and just left this one. With that though, it's only been an hour and a half, so let's go ahead and crawl into our Phantom here, and we'll get a little bit of flying and gameplay done, and use some of these older missiles in combat. On board today, we've got AIM-9Js and AIM-7E2s, and a couple of fuel tanks. And it's going to start here again in just a few seconds. So we're just going to go through startup on the jet, and then we're going to get up to a little bit of air-to-air.
Hey, what alignment do you want? Okay, stored heading. Roger. Cartridges loaded. Okay, ready for alignment? You bet. Slats out. Flaps down. Canopy down and locked. Lights out and stripes aligned.
Looking stylish with our aviators on. We're just waiting on Jester now to complete the alignment.
Roger. Wheel chogs
50, they're going to be kind of right down here in this area.
Looking good. Have a good flight. And disconnect.
Overlord 1-1, Ford 1, request bogey dope. Ford 1, Overlord 1-1, Bra 159, 450 at 15,000 cold.
Looks like we'll be flying south to go intercept those guys.
Alignment completed. You can go primary sync now. Ah, ready to taxi. This is the best job in the world. Let's do it.
I'm taking up the older weapons today. So we've talked about some of those limitations.
We planning to hit the deck on this flight? Roger. Engine's good, airspeed off the peg. ...80 knots. 100 knots.
It's 150, start rolling up. Going to climb to about 14,000 feet. And trying to engage those fighters that are showing up to the south. Departing out of Tonopah today. Alright, let's check in with our AWACS and see where our closest bandit is.
Overlord 1-1, Ford 1. Request bogey dope.
I've got 150 here. Play the waiting game as Jester goes to pick them up.
have a new bogey. Right 531 miles, 15,000.
It sounds like our boys.
Good IFF, he's a friendly.
Okay, that's tracking tankers.
Overlord 1-1. Ford 1. Request bogey dope.
That's a bogey, all right. Right 530 miles, 25,500.
It's going to be the AWACS.
Yeah, IFF returns on this one, he paints.
Now, the reason why occasionally the AWACS is telling us that we're clean is because relative to how the AWACS is flying, the Bandit is flying in such a way where he disappears off the radar. A beam to the transmitter. 147 for 45. Might start picking them out at the top of the radar glass. Just looking for something. A lot of little false echoes.
Overlord 1-1. Ford 1. Request bogey dope.
Alright, buddy, they're in 30 miles now. Roughly co-altitude.
We have a new bogey. Left 15 degrees, 22 miles, 16,000.
It's probably them.
No IFF, he's a bandit.
That's our boys.
Got a bogey, left 5, 19 miles, 14,500.
I'm gonna wait to push to an STT lock.
Not getting an IFF response. It's a hostile. Mud, 12 o'clock. SA3.
Now we're gonna push to it.
Okay, lock. 1 potato, 2 potato, 3 potato, 4 potato, fire!
Turn away from the SA3 a little bit, which will be helpful as we try and fly the intercept dot. Ideally without letting the aircraft disappear into the gimbals. They're cold to us right now, though, otherwise we would have a pretty good shot. We can see our two little lines there indicating the maximum range and the no escape zone. Or minimum range, rather, in the case of the F4. We're marching right on down to it. Lock is still very solid. Let's go and throttle up.
have a friendly KC-135, 1 o'clock, 11 miles.
There's our 2 bandits. Parameters still aren't good yet, but we're getting close. Here we go, Fox 1.
Damn it, I lost lock. Back to regular scan. There are bandits. 1 o'clock. 3 miles. One o'clock, and another at
Get the fuel tanks off the jet.
He's at our 12 o'clock, and another at 11 o'clock.
Fox 2.
3 o'clock now, and another at 12 o'clock.
Got him.
Bandit is going down.
Now, where's his friend? Where's his friend at?
Back to standard scan pattern.
Overlord 1-1, Ford 1. Request bogey dope.
Don't think so, Airwax.
Roger.
There he is coming up on the merge.
He's at our 7 o'clock high. He's at
There
our
he goes.
11 o'clock.
There he goes. All right, we're on him now.
He's at our 10 o'clock.
Oh, he's way out of range, or out of parameters, rather. We're gonna see if we can get him with a Sparrow. Put him in the bore sight cage here and long press.
Lock 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000. Shoot! He's ours now.
Got him.
Bandit is going down.
I actually used one of my switches there to turn the interlock off. That would allow us to shoot the Sparrow outside of good parameters.
We have a friendly 1 o'clock. 6 miles. I'll continue with the standard scan pattern. Damn it, target lost. Okay, sanitizing the sky again. Okay, back to normal scan.
Oh good, he's back to 50 miles. turn around, start heading back towards Tonopah. And we'll see where the rest of the bad guys are, because we got
Alright, those are some nails. 2 o'clock.
fairly
And
close down
nails,
there to an
2
SA3 site.
o'clock.
Though those nails are probably a good sign.
New bogey. Left 5, 14 miles. 7,000.
Oh, damn. That's close.
Ooh, piece of candy. I mean, bandit. Yeah, it's a bandit. Roger. Lock. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi. Shoot!
Good parameters. Box 1.
There are bandits. 11 o'clock. 2 miles.
Box 1. Probably defeated that first one. And probably our second one.
12 o'clock.
It's a MiG-19.
12 o'clock. $11 o'clock now. He's at our 6 o'clock.
Alright, we got aircraft in both vectors. It's not
Whoa, we've got
as
nails,
good,
3
so we're going to go ahead and turn
o'clock.
into his friend.
And nails, 12 o'clock.
We need to turn this into a 1v1 real quick.
He's at our 6 o'clock. $11 o'clock now. He's at our 6 o'clock. Shit, he's on our 6. He's at our 8 o'clock.
Alright, let's extend for a minute. We got both of them behind us.
Okay, he's 5 o'clock now. 5 o'clock now.
We are faster than a farmer. Oh, but this one's very close.
He's at our 6 o'clock.
See if we can pounce on his ally.
Shake him.
Hmm.
7 o'clock high now. 7 o'clock high. And another at 8 o'clock.
He actually hit us.
He's getting in shooting position.
Alright, sometimes it's better to know when to escape, so we're just going to go ahead and leave.
He's getting in shooting position. He almost has us. Shit! Lost the lock. Back to standard scan pattern.
I was really hoping to turn that into a 1v1 fight with the Sparrows. I think we've lost our TACAN as well. and some of our navigation too. They definitely hit us pretty hard.
All right, returning to standard scan.
These 30mm autocannons are nothing to balk at. At 4,000 pounds, we'll take just a moment to see if we can't find him again.
Overlord 1-1, Ford 1. Request bogey dope.
Oh, up in the clouds? That's rude.
Okay, he's 5 o'clock now. 5 o'clock now. Six o'clock now.
And if we had front aspect missiles, we would have been more fine.
He's at a 1 o'clock high and another at 1 o'clock. He's at a 4 o'clock and another at 12 o'clock. He's at our 5 o'clock high and another at 2 o'clock.
We got hit again on the way in. But that's okay. We're nearing the end of our usual stream time there for it, so we will take a moment and go back, look at TAC view, see how all that turned out, cover some of the things that we talked about, just in a brief summary, and go from there. But we were able to use the older generation missiles and successfully kill some fighters. So that was a good thing for us to see. Let's go and pull up TAC view there. This is closing down, and we'll flip the stream over to see it. I think the MiG-21 is a lot more fun of a fight now than it used to be. That was all of our talking bits, so let's go ahead and just jump right to the two fights. So as we were approaching, we saw that the intercept dot was moving way off to our right, which is more or less what I'm almost flying now. It's a little further to our right, but if I went any further, I'd have lost them in the gimbals. The radar can only scan so far left and right, but we have a couple of threats that were kind of in the area there. We've got our SA-3 site that's down there. The SA-2 site here is non-active. Well, it is and it isn't. It's not attached to one another in such a way where it can actually shoot its missiles, because it is a pure training target for, trying to get the best use out of the Shrike, that kind of deal. So anyway, our engagement. We cruised up here to these guys. I had them all locked up. They turned cold, which is why we are inside of like 6 nautical miles here. We are, if they were head on to us, we are well within the capabilities of a Sparrow to kill the target. Tail chase like this, though, not quite in good parameters, which is why we held our fire. As we closed to under 4 nautical miles, and they turned less cold, we were able to get our shot in there. It went into the chaff, as one would expect, because we also lost lock. As you can see, he is flying more or less perpendicular to us. He's crossing our T. So while the missile was guiding up to about here, at about this point, we lose him on the radar. And the moment we lost him, it was game over for that missile. That missile was done. So it failed to guide. And since we were already in the fight anyway, this guy was defensive and leaving. We turn around and we pounce on his friend, kick the fuel tanks off. Chester's keeping an eye on this other guy as he comes zipping down past us. But we are in good parameters here, so we go and fire that 9J. Successfully destroys our first bandit. As we can see, when we come down here for the launch, we got a few different parameters. We're just under a mile when we fire the missile. Our G load is somewhat small. It's just about 3 Gs, so it's in a turn, but it's not a significant turn where the missile would potentially be spoiled. And he stayed pretty much within the seeker head's limits of being able to find the target and then maneuver to it. It's probably about the best sort of shot we can get with the 9J. I did briefly uncage the seeker head, which is why it went from to silence. If that was a 9L or a 9M, you would have heard the high tone to let you know that it was ready to kill. We reset here for a head-on. And then we get just right back into the chase. Just get him selected there. Jockeying for a different position there. He just dumped a lot of his energy to get down onto the deck, which, while it made it nice for him to extend, it did allow me the opportunity to try and pick him up with the cage of mode of the radar. And once we had him caged up and held for 4 seconds, that dogfight Sparrow was able to round that corner as we let that off the rail here at about the 1 mile mark. Got out in front of our target and brought him down. Called up some friends. Fired the first Sparrow. And he got away from it. We didn't lose a lock, he just outmaneuvered the Sparrow. Fired a second Sparrow. Which passed behind our target. Some of that has to do with the fact that he was, beaming the missile. And then we get just right down to it. Back into the fight. MiG-19 a little more agile in the slow speed. Took a shot with the guns as he came across our nose. And if we were pointing down just a little bit, we probably would have caught him there. A snapshot. (1v2). He gets us, though, with a snapshot as we basically cross his nose the way the other guy crossed ours. Wasn't enough to burn us out of the fight completely, but it was enough to knock out some of our key systems. They bounded up. We got into the head-on again. And it was right there where he had a brief moment where he tapped me twice, and that was it. The aircraft lurched over to one side, and we were getting out of the frame. I don't feel as bad getting killed in a 1v2, but it would have been nice if we would have had that one Sparrow actually detonate and kill the target, or if we caught him in the guns and turned it into a 1v1. That would have made things a lot easier on us. And that's the lesson there for today. That's one of the reasons why we tend to try and do dogfights with more than one aircraft, especially in aircraft like this where we don't have the big situational awareness systems that more modern jets have, or the missiles that will guide all on their own from much further ranges out, such as AMRAAM. That would have been a whole different fight otherwise. With that, though, let's go ahead and call that there for now. Always ask for consent. Try to communicate as best you can with your partners. Try to be genuinely decent human beings. We will be back later on today for ARMA 3 at the usual time there for that. But again, I won't be on tomorrow morning as the day job has me for that. So that's why we're doing that here tonight, today. Thanks for watching there, folks. Don't forget to like, subscribe, do all those things. It really does help the channel move, grow, and develop, and helps me focus more or less on the things that you wish to hear and learn about and all those other things. And with that, we will catch you later on. Thanks for watching.